Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. My name is Robert, and today I am still continuing with my month-long Roman history, and in this video we are watching the true size of a Roman legion. These are the fighting men of the empire, the world's first professional soldiers. They were paid. And before we get into this, if you'd like to support my channel, please consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything. It's 100% free, and it really does helps my channel out. Hit the post notification bell. When I drop new content, you'll be notified. Give the video a thumbs up and feel free to leave a comment. Okay, the true size of a Roman legion, here we go.
The Roman legions are impressive for their historical achievements, but rarely do we stop to properly understand their nature at a fundamental level. How were they organized? What was their leadership structure? How large was their logistics train? What was their frontage in battle? Today, let's explore the true size of a legion of the Roman Empire. The foundation for the Roman legion was the legionary. These soldiers were Roman citizens who were drawn from across the general population. Potential recruits had to meet certain criteria and pass a series of tests. According to Vegetius, the ideal candidate was a rural man from a temperate climate who stood about 6 Roman feet tall. Upon taking their oath and undergoing 4 months of training, they would be ready to join the legions for battle. Whilst in service, each soldier would be assigned to a group of tent mates known as the contubernium. Whilst there is some debate, most academics agree that it consisted of 8 legionaries in addition to 1 to 2 military slaves, 1 to 2 mules depending on supply needs, a millstone, and a standard A-frame tent. It is with this contubernium that a legionary would spend most of his time. This brotherhood was so ironclad that the term contubernalis emerged in the Latin vernacular as a term for camaraderie. When the legion encamped, each contubernium functioned as its own self-sustaining unit. For instance, while the slaves pitched the tent, the younger legionaries might be sent to fetch fodder and firewood for the campsite as others prepared food. Grinding the grain ration, in particular, was a labor-intensive task which occurred every night. This grain was most often used for bread, biscuits, and porridge, which served as the staple for the average legionary's diet that was further supplemented by salted meat, vegetables, cheese, wine, and olive oil. When not performing essential duties, the members of a contubernium would make the most of their off time. This included things like gaming, gambling, and relaxing. When it came time to move, a contubernium's gear would be efficiently loaded for transport. Each soldier carried roughly 20 kilograms of arms and armor, in addition to their entrenching tools, bedroll, rations, and personal items. The heavier gear, such as the tent, stakes, millstone, and various other items, would be loaded onto the unit's mule. Yet while the contubernium was self-sustaining in a day-to-day sense, it was not a functional military unit that could hold its own in battle. For this purpose, 10 contubernia would be grouped together into a century for a combined total of 80 legionaries, 10 to 20 slaves, 10 to 20 mules, and 11 tents. In keeping with its battlefield role, the century was assigned a series of officers. The centurion was the commanding officer. The optio was his second in command. The tesserarius was third in command and watchman. The signifer was the standard bearer, and the cornicularius was the trumpeter. These men in turn had their own support staff, mules, tents, and other belongings. The officers were critical as the means by which the men of a century were made a part of the Roman legion as a whole. When it came to discipline and training, the commanding centurion and his optio proved integral to maintaining a well-drilled unit through their use of disciplinary staves, the vetus and the hastile, respectively. When it came to performing duties, the cornicularius helped summon the men for roll call, review, and for the march, while the tesserarius distributed the watchword and managed those on sentry duty. And finally, when it came to fiscal management, the signifer was in charge of a unit's finances, while the cornicularius was in charge of the military clerks. It was these men who tracked a soldier's pay and all of the deductions they had accrued. In this regard, it is estimated that around 2/3 of a legionary's yearly salary went towards food, clothing, and common expenses. On the march, a unit would be led by its centurion, signifer, and cornicularius, while the optio and the tesserarius likely brought up the rear and maintained the order of march. In battle, the same order appears to have been maintained, with the senior commander leading from the front right and his deputies policing the formation. The exact position of the signifer and cornicularius is debated, with some arguing that they were in close proximity to the centurion for ease of command, while others placed them further back for reasons of safety and maintaining combat effectiveness of the front rank. As the Romans of the Republic had found, while a unit of around 100 men could hold its own in battle, its strategic uses were limited. Thus, the cohort was born, as a way to combine 6 centuries into a large group of men who could have a more substantial role on and off the battlefield. In total, a standard cohort had 480 legionaries, 30 officers, 60 to 120 slaves, 60 to 120 mules, and around 66 tents. There are some idiosyncrasies of the cohort that are worth mentioning. The prestigious first cohort of every legion was made of 5 double-strength centuries for a total of 800 legionaries.
Wow.
Typically, these were the veterans of a legion, its iron core, which inspired and offered an example for the more junior soldiers of their fellow cohorts. As such, it was the unique honor of their aquilifer to carry the legionary eagle into battle. This venerated standard represented the soul of the army, being kept in a dedicated shrine at the heart of a legionary camp or fortress. The Augustan reforms standardized the size, number, and positions of the legions across the empire. Therefore, it was actually quite rare to see legions moving around in their entirety outside of major campaigns. Instead, the cohort was the typical operational subgroup which could be dispatched for all manner of duties. For instance, it might be sent out to reinforce key areas, build infrastructure, or to respond quickly to threats. This group was largely self-sustaining, underscored by the presence of cohort camps in archaeological records, which are significantly more common than legionary fortresses. When the need arose, one or more cohorts were grouped together into ad hoc units known as vexilliones, effectively a legion in miniature. These were the most common strike force in the Roman Empire. Often 2 cohorts would be sent out under a single commander, numbering about 1,000 men, which could effectively solve any problem quickly and efficiently. The largest and most iconic standard Roman force was the legion. It was composed of 10 cohorts with a theoretical paper strength of about 5,120 soldiers. Using the upper end of our prior figures, these would also bring with them about 295 officers, 1,400 slaves, 1,400 mules, and around 660 tents. But a legion had even more elements worth mentioning. For instance, Josephus tells us that during the early Principate, each legion was assigned a cavalry unit, which epigraphic evidence suggests was called the Equites Legionis. Likely, these served as scouts and bodyguards at the direct disposal of the general. They were 120 troopers strong, which were likely broken down into 4 30-man termi. In a parallel structure to the infantry sentry, each terma had a commanding officer, the decurion, 2 sub-officers, the duplicarius and the sesquiplicarius, as well as a standard bearer, the signifer. These riders had 1 to 2 spare horses, while their gear was carried by an estimated 60 mules and drivers, with the cavalrymen themselves being housed within around 15 tents. Furthermore, legions were assigned an artillery corps. Estimates vary, but it is generally accepted that each century had 1 small scorpion for a total of 60. While on major campaigns, each cohort was assigned a medium ballista for a total of 10. Additional siege equipment, such as rams and large onagers, were added as needed, but we have assumed a mix of 5 pieces. Crewing, maintaining and transporting such gear would have required a substantial siege train. No reliable records exist, but we can approximate the use of at least 15 4-oxen carts laden with the components of the medium to large siege pieces, while the smaller scorpions were carried by a mule from their respective century. Tending to the artillery and all the other engineering needs of a legion would have been the fabri. These were the members of the engineering corps whose numbers are not defined, but may have been counted at around 10 specialists, 1 per cohort, whose expertise enabled them to supervise the work of general labourers. Another critical group would have been a legion's medical staff. Once more, we have no firm numbers and will therefore assume 10 doctors, 1 per cohort, with an additional 20 assistants, 10 2-horse ambulance carts, and 10 medical tents. And last but not least among the support staff would have been the legion's scribes, which we will estimate at around 15 men with 15 supply mules. While often overlooked, these scribes were key to the institutional integrity of a legion. They maintained the records of the force, which included everything from payrolls to service logs, supply tallies, reconnaissance reports, and more.
That makes sense.
Beyond this, a legion would have had all manner of spare parts, food, personal belongings, and other items in need of transport. Without any explicit records, we will assume this would have been carried by around 50 additional mules, for a grand total of approximately 1,600 such animals.
Oh, wow.
That's almost 1 mule for every 5 men in the legion. But the ratio of animal to human rises even higher when you consider the herds of livestock which would have been shuffled along an army as a ready source of food. We will not be modelling these in this particular video.
No, it'd be a lot.
Commanding this behemoth of a force were a series of high-ranking officers: the legionary legate, the camp prefect, 6 tribunes, and additional musicians and standard-bearers. These, along with the various sub-officers, formed the all-important hierarchy of a legion. It will now be worth discussing their ranks in greater detail. We will begin with the centurions, of which there were 1 per century, and thus about 60 per legion. But not all were created equal. A strict ranking system was in place, which had its roots in the traditions of the manipular armies from the Republic. In order of highest to lowest rank, this resulted in the following centurion titles: the Pilus Prior and the Pilus Posterior, who commanded the 1st and 2nd centuries respectively; the Princeps Prior and the Princeps Posterior, who commanded the 3rd and 4th centuries;
Forward, backwards.
the Hastatus Prior and the Hastatus Posterior commanded the 5th and 6th centuries. Between cohorts, the officers of the 1st cohort were the most senior, while those of the 10th cohort were the most junior.
Oh.
It should be noted that the prestige of the first cohort centurions was recognized in that its 5 officers were known as the primi ordines, the most senior of which was the primus pilus, or first spear. This was a highly coveted post, typically lasting only a single year, and would be the crowning achievement of a long career in the army. Over time, as the legions settled down into fixed positions, the role of primus pilus would evolve to become more administrative. But beyond these career centurions, most legions were commanded by non-professional legates, selected from the senatorial class. Some exceptions did exist, such as the Legio Duo Traiana, which was commanded by an equestrian prefect. Whatever the case, the legate, or prefect, would have 6 tribunes serving directly beneath them. In the Republican period, these have also been non-professionals drawn from the political elite, but during the Principate, the 5 tribuni angusticlavi, or the narrow stripe tribunes, could also be promoted up from the centurion ranks. In contrast, the singular tribunus laticlavius, or broad stripe tribune, was typically still a young man of the senatorial class who only served with the legion for a year before returning to his political career. Together, these tribunes provided important tactical command of a legion during wartime, whilst otherwise acting as administrators. Let's now take a moment to step back and appreciate the real size of the legions in its various forms. We can begin with a hypothetical parade rest of the entire force and its gear. Together, they cover 25 square kilometers and number about 9,000. Of all the beings within this area, 80% are humans and 20% are animals. Among the people, 73% are infantry or cavalry, 4.5% are officers, 0.5% are specialists, and 22% are military slaves. But this sort of deployment is quite ahistoric. More commonly, you would find a legion in their camp, on the march, or in battle. Let's take a look at the true size of each of these. One of the most typical places to find a legion would be its home base, the Castra Legionaria. These permanent positions had begun to be established during the reign of Augustus as a means to begin fortifying the empire's various frontiers. But while they did boast moats, walls, and towers, they were not intended to serve as impregnable military hardpoints. Rather, their purpose was to serve as the staging point for offensive action. They were a place for the legions to muster, gather supplies, and oversee their area of operations. As such, these bases were well equipped with facilities ranging from administrative buildings to barracks, hospitals, granaries, armories, and more. Overall, their arrangement was quite regular, but with dimensions which stretched as needed. For our example, we assume a fort measuring about 470 by 470 meters. For perspective, this is 220,000 square meters, or about 55 acres, which is the rough equivalent of 23 soccer fields.
Wow.
Based on our records, it was actually quite rare for a legion to be at its base all at once. Much of the time, soldiers would have been dispersed on leave, on watch duty, or on all manner of other missions. Only for major campaigns would an entire legion be assembled, and when the time came, they would march out for war. This would have been done in a disciplined manner. Generally speaking, a legion deployed in the following order: the scouts, the vanguard, the officers, the main legionary body, the impedimenta or baggage train, and the rear guard. There are many nuances we could get into, but this description will have to suffice for now. For this depiction, we have modelled our previously described legion on the march with a maximum of 6 men abreast. This assumption is consistent with the widest of Roman roads, which measure around 6 meters across. In this arrangement, the entire column of about 7,200 men and 1,900 animals stretches out over 1.9 kilometers. At a walking speed of around 5 kilometers an hour, it would take 23 minutes for a single legion and its baggage train to pass.
Wow.
At a gallop, it would take a rider going 40 kilometers an hour about 3 minutes to ride across the entire length of the column. But this assumes quite idealized conditions.
Yeah.
If roads were narrow and progress delayed for any reason, a single legion could easily double in length, stretching well over 3.8 kilometers, taking 45 minutes to pass, and requiring 6 minutes to ride from back to front. It's no wonder an army in such a formation was highly vulnerable whilst on the move. But assuming no attack took place, a legion would strike camp each night in its journey across the lands. In this way, it would slowly advance into enemy territory. When battle was eventually to be joined, a legion would now deploy for combat. While armies of the Republic tended to deploy in the standard triplex axes, those of the Empire were far more flexible. The exact manner in which legions might be deployed would depend on the situation and the preferences of their commander. Almost universally, however, they would still have honored the prudent idea of troops being deployed to the center, the wings, and most importantly, the reserves. For this example, we have assumed that in a vacuum, our single legion has adopted a Republican-style triple axis. Here, the 2,000 soldiers of cohort 7 through 10 form the first line. The 1,500 soldiers of cohorts 4 through 6 form the second line. And the 1,900 soldiers of cohorts 1 through 3 with the cavalry form the third line to defend the rear and act as an emergency reaction force. Zooming in, I will note that most scholars agree that soldiers in a unit stood 1 meter side to side and 2 meters front to back. Assuming a typical sentry is arranged in 8 ranks of 10 men, it occupies a space of 16 by 13.5 meters. Additionally, if we assume that multiple sentries maintain 2 or 3 meters of separation side to side and 8.5 meters front to back, we are left with a total formation whose frontage is about 609 meters across and 138 meters deep.
What?
To contextualize this, we can state that it would take a soldier about 4.5 minutes to walk across the front and a rider about half a minute to make the same trip at a gallop. An archer with an upper bow range of 200 meters could only fire across 33% of the legion's frontage. For someone looking across this same distance, a human-sized figure on the other end would be quite difficult to discern. The logistical implications of all this are certainly relevant to the experience of being on an ancient battlefield. And yet we must also keep in mind that the most important battles of the Roman era involved far more than a single legion, and that the entire empire at its height had at least 30. Thus, you must take all the figures we have shared in this video and multiply them many times over to even begin to wrap your head around the scales we are talking about.
Wow.
For now, though, I hope that this explanation has at least given you a basic understanding of the subject and the value of putting such matters in their proper spatial context.
Well, there we have it. A true size of a Roman legion. Yeah, that was quite something. Right after the video ended, I did a Google search on how many legions Julius Caesar had with him in Gaul. And it said in 58 BC, he entered Gaul with 4 legions. And then returned in 49 BC with 11 legions. Wow. That's a lot of men. That's incredible. Well, I hope you enjoyed that just as much as I did, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great day. Goodbye.